My guest at this time is Ilan Berman. He's the vice president at the American Foreign Policy Council. We want to get his analysis following the surprisingly large win for the Conservative Party in British parliamentary elections on Thursday. It was expected that the Conservative Party would win the most seats. There was open debate as to whether they would find a majority just within the seats they won or they'd have to forge a coalition. But in the end, they not only got the majority just among seats won by the Conservative Party, but roughly 30 seats to spare as well. So what happened and what's the significance of all this? That's what we'll discuss. And Ilan, thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, great to be here as always.
Well, obviously, the Conservatives and Prime Minister Boris Johnson made this a referendum on Brexit. The Labour Party and others tried to make it about other things. In the end, it looks like the British public decided we just want this resolved one way or the other. It could also be a statement of we don't want to go down the path where Jeremy Corbyn is our leader. So it's always difficult to assume what every voter who votes a certain way is thinking. But what do you think the big takeaways are here?
Right. No, I think far and away Brexit was top of mind for British voters, as it should be, because the national debate in the UK has been dominated by the question of whether the government should stay or the government should remove itself from the European Union for the last 3 years. The consensus, it seems to be, is pretty solidly divided between the people who have voted leave, who believe that the UK's fortunes are best served by exiting the EU, and those that are what they call the remainers, those that want to remain as part of the EU. And what's happened over the last 18 months or so has been this dramatic shift in terms of what is acceptable. As the deadline for Brexit has drawn ever closer, the necessity of some sort of framework that would allow the UK to exit Europe in an orderly fashion without major economic or political disruption has become more acute. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has drafted a plan that seems to be a reasonable compromise, that seems to secure all of these equities. And this was very much a vote of confidence in his plan because the deadline is right around the corner. It's at the end of January.
And you mentioned the 3-year stalemate that's been going on here. And part of that is as soon as Brexit was approved, the voters decided to leave. David Cameron resigned. Theresa May came in, on the one hand, vowing to see it through, but on the other hand, not really being a fan of it. So now that you've got Boris Johnson saying, yes, we're leaving, we're clear in our messaging here, what do you expect to see?
Right. No, that's right. And the deal that Boris Johnson is pursuing, and the one that he effectively got a mandate to draw to a conclusion next month, is a good deal softer than what we were talking about initially in terms of Brexit. It talks about continuation of lots of economic relationships that had the potential to be severed between the UK and the European Union. And it's really a testament to how much the Overton window has shifted on the debate over Brexit. There was a very heated public discussion about whether the idea of departing from the European Union was, in fact, a good idea. And this was something that occupied something like 2 years of British public policy debate. But as the deadline has drawn closer, what the Conservatives are proposing, this sort of framework deal that envisions a future outside of the European Union, seems more and more palatable to the population because otherwise there's really no map for where the country is going.
Ilan, where does this leave the Labour Party? They're obviously a prominent party in the United Kingdom, but if you look over the last 40 years, of course, the Conservative Party's Margaret Thatcher won the prime ministership in 1979. So in the intervening 40 years, the only elected Labour prime minister is Tony Blair, and he seems to have gotten there by tacking more towards the center than towards the left, unlike Jeremy Corbyn in so many different ways. So where do you see them headed in the future?
Right. Well, and it's worth noting that this defeat for the Labour Party was the single largest defeat, electoral defeat, since 1935. And we can all sort of remember the political wins that were gathering in 1935 that led the British public to vote for conservative leadership on the eve of World War II. So this is a stunning defeat. It's also, by the way, a referendum, not just on Boris Johnson's Brexit plan and his leadership, but it's also a referendum on the alternative leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, because Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, has been an enormously polarizing personality. He has fostered and abetted anti-Semitism and support for radical groups in the Middle East as part of his tenure. He is an enormously controversial figure in the British electorate itself. And this was very much a repudiation of the idea that he could be perceived as a national leader. And it shows, because when the vote was tallied, when the votes had come in and there was no doubt about Labour's route, Corbyn stepped up and he said that in the future he wouldn't be the Labour leader, right? This was a rebuke to him personally, and he understood it.
Well, let's get to what matters to a lot of our listeners most, of course, and how does this impact the United States? I know we're working on a separate trade agreement since they're about to leave the EU and so forth, but what does it mean that the voters delivered this decisive of a victory for the Conservatives when it comes to the U.S.-UK relationship?
Right. Well, this is quite clearly a shot in the arm politically for Boris Johnson, and it's also quite clearly a shot in the arm for the bilateral relationship with the United States, because the Trump administration has made very clear that if the UK does follow through on Brexit, if Great Britain departs from the European Union, that the U.S. would be there. The U.S. would essentially upgrade its economic and political relationship in a way that would mitigate some of the rough edges caused by ouster from or departure from the European Union. So now the ball very much is in Washington's court. The Trump administration has to follow through on these promises. It has to give confidence-building measures to the British public because in a very real sense, the Trump administration has thrown its political weight behind Boris Johnson and his leadership, and so now it has to follow through.
Ilan, last question here. We see it in American elections all the time, a landslide in one cycle. The next cycle looks very different. 2008, 2010 certainly come to mind, for example. So it has to be asked, even though the Conservatives are celebrating over in the UK today, what would screw this up for them in short order?
Right. Well, so I think the devil's in the details, and how the British government actually guides the country out of the European Union, disentangles itself from this sort of maze of administrative and bureaucratic relationships that it has built with the European Union over the last 30 years, matters a great deal. Johnson's leadership in guiding this transition is hugely important, as is his ability to get dividends from the United States, dividends from other countries that are eager to trade and deal more closely with an independent Great Britain.
Ilan, we'll be watching, as will a lot of folks over there. Thanks very much for being with us.
My pleasure.
Ilan Berman is the Vice President at the American Foreign Policy Council. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.